So my name is Jessica Grannis. I'm the Adaptation Program Manager for the Georgetown Climate Center. And since the impacts and the science have been addressed so nicely, I'm going to talk about what people are doing about that. But first, I want to start with Sandy, just like everyone else. I think from a journalist standpoint, there's a lot of challenge for journalists about how to talk about these extreme weather events. They're big media events, and everybody wants to connect them to climate, but the science on whether you can is uncertain. And I think from the policy context, what we've seen from the science and the impacts is it really doesn't matter if one particular event can be directly linked to climate change or not. What matters is that this is what the future holds. Sandy gave us a window into what we're going to see more and more of in the future. And so as a result, we need to prepare. And I'm only going to show you one graph. I know you've seen a lot of graphs today, but I think some of the best messengers that I like to quote are the military, the insurance industry, and I also like to throw an astronaut in there when I can. But this is a graph from the insurance industry, and it shows you that the green line, and I'll use my pointer, the green line here is meteorological events, so events that can be connected to climate, drought, hurricanes, flood events. And you can see over the last couple decades, there's been a steep increase of these meteorologically climate-related events, whereas the non-climate-related events like earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions have remained relatively constant. So again, this shows us that the frequency of these extreme events where we're seeing big impacts to people and property are on the uptick. And in a climate change world, we're going to see more and more of these impacts. So what are folks doing about it? At the federal level, in February 2013, the federal agencies were all directed as per executive order to develop adaptation plans to look at their lands and facilities and see what their vulnerabilities to climate impacts are going to be. In July of 2013, and one of the hottest days of the year at Georgetown, Obama released his climate action plan calling for both federal action on reducing greenhouse gas emissions as well as helping states and local governments prepare for climate impacts. So as part of that effort, he convened the state, local, and tribal climate preparedness task force that has been meeting over the course of the last couple months, looking at how you retool some of our existing federal programs to better support state and local adaptation. And you'll get a better sense of why we need that from some of my later slides. And so someone asked earlier what's happening on the state and local level. And so we are seeing some activity at the state and local level on planning. All the states here shown in dark blue have statewide comprehensive adaptation plans where they've assessed their vulnerabilities and they've developed a list of the strategic actions they want to take to prepare. Lighter blue states are ones that have started a planning process but haven't adopted a plan yet, and the black dots indicate local governments that have developed plans. As you'll see, this is some good activity, but it's still only a handful of states and localities, far fewer than what we need to really be prepared for some of the impacts that we were talking about earlier. And you'll also note that some of the most vulnerable states, particularly for those large hurricane events in Hurricane Alley, the Gulf and Atlantic coasts, don't have plans on the books. And in some places, they've actually legislated that you can't talk about sea level rise. And I mean, this map also doesn't reflect some of the political reality where administrations change, priorities change, and even though Florida, for example, is colored blue on the map, because of the change in administration, there isn't any longer a real state-level support for adaptation activities, and a lot of that activity has shifted to the local level, and the ball has been picked up by some of the local governments. In the next couple of months, the Georgetown Climate Center will be releasing a tool that tracks implementation of the statewide plans. So it's not enough to just have a plan on the books, you need to put it into action. So this tool is going to look at, are they implementing the recommendations in their plans? And what we're finding from our preliminary results is that there's a lot of activity in terms of soft policy, so activities like capacity building, developing tools, assessing your vulnerabilities, but there's a lot less activity on concrete changes to law and policy and how you're building things on the ground that will actually make you more resilient to future impacts. And my next couple of slides, I think, are my hypothesis of why. So in the coastal context, you have 4 buckets of policies that you can use to increase your resilience to impacts. You can construct shoreline protection. That can be anything from a seawall to a wetland or a dune that provides natural defenses. You also have land use regulations. You can control where people are developing, and you can make them build things stronger and higher so that they're resilient to flood impacts. You have disaster recovery dollars, so in the event that you are impacted, there's money available to help you rebuild and recover. And then you have the insurance component. And the challenge is that in the coastal context, all of these 4 buckets of policies are regulated at all 3 levels of government by a very complicated web of different laws, policies, and regulations. So in the coastal defense scenario, we're dealing with the Clean Water Act. In the land use context, we're primarily dealing with local floodplain regulations, but those are affected by many different things. We'll talk about disaster relief later. And the National Flood Insurance Program was a question raised earlier. So in the US, the private market has largely withdrawn from insuring for flood losses, and we provide flood insurance through the federal National Flood Insurance Program. And the primary challenge for all of these laws is that they are all based on the principle of stationarity, meaning that we use historical data as our baseline. That's how we determine how we're going to regulate. We look at what flooded historically and say, oh, that's what's at risk, and so we're going to continue to regulate there. And as you learned from the previous 2 presentations, that in an era with climate change, the history is not a good projection for what our future is going to look like. And so the maps that FEMA develops to implement the flood insurance program are a really good example of why stationarity and using historical data make us grossly unprepared for the risks that we're facing with sea level rise. Those maps not only determine how much insurance rates cost, but they also control how locals regulate their flood plains for flood impacts. And they also affect the disaster relief recovery programs. And so this is FEMA. This is an example of how the floodplain maps are not helping us become more resilient. So the blue area here shown is the 100-year floodplain for New York City. The 100-year floodplain is the area that would have a 1% chance of flooding in any given year based upon historical flood data. In New York, this map hadn't been updated since the 1980s, so it didn't account for anything from what had changed in terms of sea level over that couple of decades, nor any of the development that increases flood risks from just, increasing pervious coverage. The pink or the orange area is what actually flooded during Sandy. And so the consequence of this is that in that blue area, only those people were required to carry flood insurance, and only in those blue areas was New York City forced to regulate for flood impacts. So all of that orange area was, you can assume, pretty unprepared for the impacts that they experienced. And so land use is the primary method that we deal with flooding in this country, and it's controlled by local governments through local floodplain ordinances, and I'm going to use my cartoon village to explain and connect how those maps affect local decision making. So again, the blue area is what FEMA says is your 100-year floodplain where you're at risk of flooding, and local governments regulate in those areas. Everything outside of it just applies normal land use ordinances. With sea level rise, as we've seen, flooding is going to be driven further inland and flood heights are going to increase. The other challenge and problem with the way that we regulate floodplains is that we apply a one-size-fits-all approach in most places. The standard practice of protecting against flood risk is the house on stilts approach. So just elevate it and protect it from flood heights. So what we've been working with folks here in the Maryland area is looking at how locals can think about flood risk and change how they regulate development in flood-prone areas based upon what's at risk. So in areas where you have a lot of critical infrastructure and dense urban development, you may want to take a different approach than you would take in areas where you have a lot of agricultural uses, less dense development. So you could protect the area where you have critical infrastructure, take that accommodation approach, house on stilts approach in areas with medium density, and in areas where you have less dense development, agricultural uses, encourage folks to relocate out of the floodplain and use natural features to provide flood buffers. And so this is actually being applied in some places. San Francisco recently updated their regulations to require developers for new development to look at the risks to a project from future sea level rise. And they're still developing in the coast because it's a very valuable place to develop, but they're requiring people to mitigate the risks to their projects. And so this is a site plan proposed development project in Treasure Island, which is right in the middle of the San Francisco Bay and very vulnerable to sea level rise. And so what the developer proposed is to use all of these strategies on this large parcel. So provide natural buffers to flooding by dedicating open space, elevating structures on the higher portions of the lot, clustering the high density development on the highest portion of the lot, and they're even requiring them to set aside money to pay for flood protection in the event that floodwaters rise above what is projected, so having an ultra precautionary approach to this project. And similar provisions have been recently enacted in Boston, where they're again requiring new developers to evaluate the risks to their development project and mitigate for those risks. So what are our other types of strategies? So the flood insurance program, the National Flood Insurance Program, has been in the news a lot of late, as you may have followed. And the reason why is because when the flood insurance program was set up in the 60s, we decided from a policy standpoint that we were going to subsidize people with existing development in the floodplain. So everybody, as communities came into the program, if they had existing homes and businesses, those structures became grandfathered and they were eligible for subsidized flood insurance. So a lot of these people have been paying highly subsidized rates for a very long time. That has caused the flood insurance program to basically become insolvent. At last estimate, it was $24 or $23 billion in debt. And so in past years, Congress passed the Biggert-Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act, which called on FEMA to phase out a lot of these flood insurance subsidies. And so when people started running the numbers, they realized that some of these properties that had been grandfathered for many years were risking and facing a tenfold increase in their insurance rates. And so FEMA sort of got hit by the double-edged sword, where they have this big program that everybody relies on to provide flood insurance, but they can't actually price insurance rates to reflect the true risk of living in those areas, because by now trying to balance out this program, they're basically threatening to price a lot of homeowners out of their last line of defense, their insurance. They're not able to pay that $25,000 a year insurance rate, and there was huge political pushback, and so Congress went back to the drawing board, rolled back some of those insurance reforms, but we still face this kind of existential challenge of what do we do with the flood insurance program? Is it designed to, price insurance accurately? Do we want it to be solvent and pay for itself? And how long are we going to keep it with $24 billion in debt? So the third type of strategy is coastal protection. And here I'm going to simplify things, but the historical way that we've controlled flooding and erosion is by building seawalls like this one, big engineered structures that keep floodwaters out. The problem that we've realized with this approach is that it has large environmental impacts. It degrades the beaches and the wetlands, which are the reason why people live in these areas. And so increasingly, policymakers are trying to implement greener approaches. This is a living shoreline here in Maryland, where they use a combination of wetlands restorations and low rock sills to provide flood and erosion control. The problem is that, in the immortal words of Kermit the Frog, it's not easy being green. And part of the challenge is that in that intertidal area where land meets the sea, you have 3 layers of regulators. You have the Army Corps of Engineers under the Clean Water Act, who permits projects that have land disturbing action in that intertidal area. You also have state regulators that regulate their coastal zones, and you have local land use controls. And a living shoreline project typically spans that entire area, and it can trigger permits from all 3 of these levels of government, and sometimes several different agencies within levels of government. And then a compounding problem is that where the Corps regulates, historically they've had streamlined permitting for the traditional engineered approach. They're the Army Corps of Engineers, they know how to build walls, and so they have an easy path for building walls that takes a couple weeks to a month to get a permit, and you can start building your wall. For the living shorelines approach, it's a much more experimental, new type of project, takes a lot more site-specific review, and it can take up to 3 years to get a permit for these types of projects. So that red tape is driving some folks to build engineered structures rather than take the green approach. So my last example is disaster recovery. Disaster, and I'm going to tell it from the perspective of Vermont and what it experienced after Hurricane Irene. The state had massive rainfall that caused bridges and roads to be washed out because they had these older pipe culverts underneath all of their bridge that became blocked, and with the force of the water just blew out the roads. So in the aftermath of the storm, they were given federal disaster relief dollars to rebuild, and they installed larger bottomless culverts that don't get blocked as easy. They allow much more stream flow, and they also allow fish to pass through. And it seemed like a no-brainer because in Vermont, they're projected to see dramatic increases in precipitation. So they needed to build things bigger and stronger so that they didn't experience the same impacts again. The problem is that the disaster relief laws, the Stafford Act, was basically designed to put communities back to where they were before the storm. So it allows communities to be reimbursed to their pre-disaster condition. So FEMA, in faith to its authorizing statute, wanted and was going to reimburse the localities to put back in those old pipe culverts, even though they didn't really make sense and weren't the best engineering concept. And they refused to reimburse the localities for these larger, or for the extra costs of for these larger bottomless culverts. And FEMA, Vermont, as a result, has had to go on a case-by-case basis to FEMA headquarters and appeal each one of these decisions to get reimbursed to build bigger and stronger. So those are 4 examples of some of the legal challenges that our states and localities and federal agencies face in terms of you know, taking this system that's backward looking and trying to revamp it for a world where we have future risk. So there's red tape there too. So my take home messages, I think from a journalist perspective, it's pretty clear the scientists are certain that climate risks are increasing and we're going to see more frequent and more intense extreme weather events that cause great risk to life and cost a lot to our national treasury. Good work is happening on the ground at the state, local, and the federal agency level, but not nearly enough to protect us against the risk that we face. To get to where we need to be, these great plans that we're developing at all levels of government need to connect to action, which requires us to rethink some of these laws and policies that we have on the books that are putting up unnecessary roadblocks to adaptation. And I think we need all levels of government to participate in this dialogue. And one of the primary challenges that I see is that Congress is pretty much absent on this debate. A lot of the activity is happening through the federal agencies, and they're trying to work with their existing laws and authorities that were developed in the 80s before we even knew the word climate change. And that is because Congress refuses to really engage on the question of how do we retool some of these statutes that need fixing, like the Stafford Act. So, and we'll have some resources available for you to look at. We track the state plans and who has plans, and in June we'll be launching a tool that will track implementation of those plans, and we have analyses of some of these policy barriers that I talked about today. So thank you for your time.